How does famous romance novelist Paul Sheldon escape his number one fan's house after she freaks out about him killing her favorite character? Let's read to find out. Welcome back to BG's Books. I'm Mr. BG, and today I will be reviewing Misery by Stephen King. So, in my last video, which was my review on Christine, I mentioned that Christine used to be my second favorite Stephen King book, and then after reading another one, it became my third. Well, Misery is my second, so it's time to review Misery. So yeah, Misery, of course, is about best-selling romance novelist Paul Sheldon, who, after a near-fatal car crash, gets rescued by his number one fan, named Annie Wilkes. And then, after a very unfortunate thing that she finds out about him, her hospitality quickly turns into a nightmare. That's generally the main point of the story, but there's a lot more to unpack. But, yeah, so let's get into the review of this. So Misery begins when Paul Sheldon has already had his car crash and is in Annie Wilkes' house. That's something that the book does differently than the movie, because the movie, he starts in the car and then we see him crash and stuff. But in the book, we never see that. The book just starts with him in Annie Wilkes' house. Anyway, he wakes up, he meets Annie Wilkes, and then he discovers that she's a really big fan. In fact, she tells him that she is his number one fan. So for a little bit, stuff is just kind of normal. Like they're snowed in, so she can't really call an ambulance or a hospital or something to come get them. And in the meantime, Annie is reading Paul's newest book, Misery's Child, which is supposed to be the last Misery book. But at the end, she finds out that Misery Chastain dies in childbirth. And Misery Chastain is her favorite book character of all time. So she is not pleased, to say the least. So she gets really mad, scares Paul and stuff. It's that's something that Annie Wilkes does well. It's she just gets really mad and just scares Paul a lot. And so Paul's trying to make excuses, and Annie's no, I will not accept that. So anyway, some more stuff happens, and then Annie decides, okay, fine, you can have Misery die at the end of Misery's Child, but you have to confirm that she's still alive at the end of, or at the beginning of the next Misery book, Misery's Return. And then Paul's but I was planning on killing Misery off. I don't know what you want me to do. So Annie Wilkes buys him a typewriter and some paper and sets him to work. So then, over the course of the story, this story is about 351 pages from what I counted. Paul just works on the book, and then other stuff happens. And then he's actually really getting into it. He's really enjoying writing Misery and stuff and everything. But of course, since he's captive, this book takes place over the course of about 4 months. He started in February, and the book ends in about June, I think. So basically, Paul has a couple chances to escape. It's Annie, I guess, had some bobby pins fall on the floor, so he uses those, picks the locks, and gets out of his room. So then basically he just kind of explores. And he explores 3 times. The first time, he just wanted to get some water, I think. The second time, he wanted to get some food. And then the third time, well, I guess I should go back to the second time. On the second time, before he goes back to his room, he discovers Annie Wilkes' diary, or I guess a scrapbook called Memory Lane, and it basically reveals a lot about her character. It's she's crazy, okay? So basically the scrapbook is just obituaries of people that she's killed. It's back in the late 50s, I think, she started an apartment fire that killed 5 people, but her family was okay. And then in nursing school, she killed her roommate. And then when she became the head nurse, she started killing infants and stuff. It's she is absolutely just a terrible human being. and then later on we found out that she also killed her dad and stuff. So that is just terrible. And Paul's like, she is a psycho. I have to get rid of her somehow. So anyway, he goes back into his room and just sleeps. But the third time, now I can talk about the third time. The third time he goes out of the room, he gets a knife to try and kill her. And so he thinks that that's going to go well, but then he is sorely mistaken when the very famous hobbling scene happens. So if you remember the movie, the hobbling scene just consisted of like Annie grabbing a sledgehammer and then just going to town on Paul Sheldon's ankles. But it happens differently in the book, and it is much more horrific in the book. So instead of getting a sledgehammer, she gets an axe, and then she chops into his left foot once, and then stuff is already starting to sever. And then she pulls it out in the most painful way, goes down again, and then his foot comes off. And then to make matters worse, she has a blowtorch with her. She cauterizes the wound with a blowtorch. Yeah, I know, poor Paul. He goes through a lot of misery in this book. Yeah, get it? Because it's called Misery. Yeah, I know it's stupid, but yeah. So anyway, Paul gets back to work and stuff, and this one cop actually comes looking for him because, it's been about 4 months at this point, and people are kind of wondering where he is. So he alerts the cop to his presence, and the cop's like, yo, dang, that's Paul Sheldon. And then Annie comes up, stabs him with her cow's cross because her cow died. So she takes the cross from the grave and then just stabs him a bunch of times. And then for the final kill, she revs up her riding lawnmower and then just mows the guy down, which is very horrific to say the least. And then Paul is still horrified. He's like, what in the world, So anyway, he gets back to work. He's still going for more days and stuff. And then these two other cops, nicknamed David and Goliath, because one is a small guy and one's quite a bigger guy. And so they're just kind of asking Annie Wilkes questions and stuff. They want to do some things, and so she lets him in. And then Paul decides to just not alert them because Annie said that she only killed that first guy because Paul alerted him. So Paul decides to keep them alive and stuff. So then they leave, and then Paul gets back to work. But, so here's the thing. Paul had been working, or had finished another book prior to his run-in with Annie Wilkes called Fast Cars. It was supposed to be one of his breakout novels that wasn't about misery. And Annie Wilkes didn't like the profanity and stuff, so she had him burn it to work on Misery's Return. And so he's just thinking, that was such a great book. I shouldn't have burned it. That was such a great book. And he had this rule to where he never made copies. So he just can't get another one. He would have to rewrite it if he did at all. So what he does is that Paul finally finishes Misery's Return, and as he and Annie Wilkes are about to celebrate the return of misery for good, you know what happens? Burn. So the manuscript is burning, and then Annie's freaking out and stuff, and then this is where the fight happens. So then, of course, the fight goes mostly the same way it does in the movie, but there's a couple differences which I'll explain. He stuffs the charred paper into her throat, so she's choking and stuff, and she gets up, and then she trips over her typewriter, falls onto the mantelpiece, and then just cracks her skull open. And so Paul is like, okay, she's finally dead. So then he tries to crawl out of the room, but nope, she's still alive. And then they tussle some more, and then Annie Wilkes just kind of dies from there. So then he's like, is she finally dead? Is she finally dead? So anyway, some time passes. David and Goliath, whose names are not David and Goliath, but other names that I've actually forgotten, so I'm sorry about that. They find him just huddled up against a table or whatever, and he's like, she's in the room, I know she's alive, she's in the room. And so they look in the room, they're like, no one's there. So they rescue Paul and give him to safety, hooray! Anyway, so it turns out that Annie Wilkes did survive that last little tussle with Paul, and she made it all the way out to the barn where she grabbed a chainsaw, and then she died as she was holding the chainsaw. So there you go. Anyway, so 9 months later, because I forgot to mention that Paul only burned a fake copy of Misery's Return. He actually hid the real manuscript under his bed. So, he has that survived, that gets published, and it becomes like the best Misery book ever. It sells like crazy. And then his editor approaches him about doing a nonfiction book about his time at the Wilkes house. He's like, yeah, I don't know about that. So anyway, things are going great. He gets a prosthetic foot. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention he also loses his left thumb. That's not as important as the foot thing, but yeah, he also is missing a thumb now because Annie Wilkes was just crazy. But so yeah, life is just going good for Paul Sheldon. He's in and out of the hospital. He's getting better. He's getting over his Annie Wilkes stuff, but he still has a couple nightmares about her every now and then. See, yeah, so it's like in one of his visions, she just like decapitates him and stuff, but it's all a dream. He's okay. And then one day, Paul doesn't think he's ever going to write a book again, but as he's walking home from lunch with his editor, he finds a teenager or a boy or something, kid, walking with a shopping cart with a bird cage and a skunk. Well, not necessarily a bird cage, but there's a cage in a shopping cart, and then a skunk is in that bird cage. So anyway, Paul decides, I think I might have another idea for a book after all. And that's how it ends. So, Misery is a fantastic book. I highly recommend it. As I said, Christine was my second favorite Stephen King book until I read Misery. And then after I read Misery for the first time, this was a reread, by the way, I guess I should have mentioned that. But after I read Misery for the first time, I just fell in love with it. Now, this is my second favorite Stephen King book. The only one better is Carrie, which isn't even on screen, but I promise he was right there. But yeah, so Misery is like super good, and it's even really short, so it's not quite as long a read as Christine is. You could read this in about maybe 2 or 3 days. But yeah, the thing I love about Misery most is that it doesn't really have like a main story. It's just two characters just interacting with each other, trying to outsmart the other. And that's really the genius about this. And there's also another part that's genius about this. So Stephen King wrote this book when he was on drugs and he was becoming sober. And this book was published after he got sober, or while he was getting sober. And he's gone on countless times to say that Annie Wilkes is the real-life representation of cocaine, and he, in a way, is Paul Sheldon. So in the end of the book, when Paul Sheldon kills Annie Wilkes, Stephen King kills his cocaine addiction. So yeah, that's another thing I really like about this book, is that it's basically a sobriety tale told in the form of an author and a crazy fan. So yeah, I mean, I really love this book. I recommend every single one of you to go read it and watch the movie as well, because the movie is also incredible. It is super accurate to the book outside of a couple scenes, but that's par for the course. But yeah, so Misery book is amazing. Misery movie is amazing. And yeah, it's a short read, so if you like shorter books, it's only like 351 pages, then I think you'll have a really good time with this. And it's just fully character driven the whole time. It's like you only really meet two major main characters, which are Paul Sheldon and Annie Wilkes. And they are like some of the two best main characters Stephen King has ever written. Like there are very few books I've read with better characters than Misery. But yeah, anyway, that's about all the time I have for you today, and that was Misery. But I kind of escaped Annie Wilkes' house so I could make this review. So, yeah, see ya. Hey, Annie, there you are. What are you doing with that axe? No, I like my left foot. No!